Israel went into Egypt with 70 people, and after approximately 750 years came out with over 2 million people, and hordes of other slaves who came out and became also part of the emerging new nation of Israel. So Israel, the biblical Israel, was a black nation, an African nation that came out of Africa and kept constant ties with Africa. And so we have to remember then that Jesus was a black Messiah, not a white Messiah, and he comes out of the whole historical background of Africa, of African traditions, of African history, of African culture, the concept of communalism, the concept of a chosen people, the concept of kingdom of God on earth. All these things were out of African tradition, not out of the white man's tradition. And Jesus was essentially a revolutionary Messiah who was trying to lead a black people in a revolt, in a struggle and conflict with a white Gentile oppressor. So the whole church has to be viewed from the point of view of the white oppressor. The white oppressor has one kind of Christianity, has one kind of church. The black church has to become independent and go back to the historic African roots of Christianity.
The biblical Abraham was a man of color, a black man. So why aren't the modern-day Israelites people of color? Why aren't they black-skinned? Why shouldn't they be? In the book, The Original Black Jews by Windsor, Rudolph R., 1935, the author discusses the origins of the Hamites and Shemites, or Semites. He states that the original Israelites were of the black race, and that the biblical Abraham, or Abram, was a black Shemite, which happens to be a descendant of Shem. Abraham was the father of both the Hebrew Israelite and Arab nations. The Hebrew Israelites would mean Jacob, twin brother to Esau, who later would become Israel, whose children would be Israelites. On the other hand, the Arab nations would mean Ishmael, Abraham's first child and son whom he had with the Egyptian Hagi, who happened to be the slave maid of Abraham's wife Sarah. The Creator's words had come to pass, according to the biblical scriptures, that the both would turn out to be great nations. The black Shemites intermarried with black Hamite Egyptian women, giving rise to the Arab nation. The author also states that Arabia was originally inhabited by the Ethiopians, who are also known as the Cushites, prior to the progenitors of the Arabs. Many of today's Arabs are not black due to the introduction of white slavery. The story of King Solomon of Jerusalem and the Queen of Sheba, known as Makeda by the Ethiopians, points to the origins of the present black Jews of Ethiopia, known as the Falashas. The Falashas claim descent from the child of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, Menelik first. The queen had returned to Sheba, which was part of the Ethiopian Empire, with Menelik first. Later on, Menelik was sent to his father in Jerusalem to be educated, where he accepted the name David. The Jews who returned to Ethiopia with Menelik are claimed to be the ancestors of the Falashas. The Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, was also believed to be a descendant of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The book also describes the origins of Christianity and Islam, which are the offspring of Judaism. Here, the author refers to Christianity and Islam as the two daughters of Judaism. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the terms Hebrews and Israelites usually describe the same people, stating that they were called Hebrews before the conquest of the land of Canaan and Israelites afterwards. The Hebrews were an ancient Semitic-speaking people. Historians mostly consider the Hebrews as synonymous with the Israelites, with the term Hebrew denoting an Israelite from the nomadic era that preceded the establishment of the United Kingdom of Israel. According to the Deuteronomistic history in the Hebrew Bible, a united monarchy or United Kingdom of Israel existed under the reigns of Saul, Eshbaal, David, and Solomon, encompassing the territories of both the later kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Whether the united monarchy existed, and if so, to what extent, is a matter of ongoing academic debate. During the 1980s, some biblical scholars had begun to argue that the archaeological evidence for an extensive kingdom before the late 8th century BCE is too weak, and that the methodology used to obtain the evidence is flawed. Scholars had remained divided among those who support the historicity of the biblical narrative, those who doubt or dismiss it, and those who support the kingdom's theoretical existence while maintaining that the biblical narrative is exaggerated. Proponents of the kingdom's existence traditionally dated to between c. 1047 BCE and c. 930 BCE. However, in some instances, the designation Hebrews may also be used historically in a wider sense, referring to the Phoenicians or other ancient civilizations, such as the Shasu, on the eve of the late Bronze Age collapse. It appears 34 times within 32 verses of the Hebrew Bible. According to the basic interpretation, the ancestral lineage of the 12 tribes of Israel suggests that they were originally black, tracing their roots back to African ancestors. The tribes are explicitly named in the Bible, which traces their roots back to the ancient Jewish patriarchs. Having seen that the ancient Israelites had African origins, I bet the question running through your mind will be, what then is the historical background of the modern-day white Jewish population, and how did they come to be identified as Israelites? The term white Israelis typically refers to Israeli citizens who are of European or Caucasian descent, particularly those from Ashkenazi Jewish backgrounds. Ashkenazi Jews are descendants of Jewish communities that originated in Central and Eastern Europe, and many of them migrated to Israel during the 20th century. However, it's important to note that the concept of whiteness is complex and can be problematic, as it often carries connotations of privilege, power, and racial hierarchy. In Israel, the category of white Israelis can be seen as a social and political construct, as it encompasses a diverse range of communities and ethnicities. Some of the groups that might be included in the category of white Israelis are 1. Ashkenazi Jews of European descent. In the 8th century, a Turkic people called the Khazars ruled a vast empire in Eastern Europe, stretching from modern-day Ukraine to Kazakhstan. The Khazars were a powerful and influential nation, strategically located between Europe and Asia, controlling key trade routes, including the Silk Road. Around 740 CE, the Khazar king Bulan converted to Judaism, and many of his people followed suit. This conversion was likely influenced by Jewish merchants and traders who traveled along the Silk Road, introducing Judaism to the Khazar elite. The Khazars established a Jewish kingdom with its capital in Atil, modern-day Astrakhan, Russia. The kingdom was a hub of intellectual and spiritual activity, attracting Jewish scholars and teachers from across the ancient world. The Khazar Jews developed their own distinct traditions, blending Jewish practices with Turkic and Slavic customs. By the 10th century, the Khazar kingdom declined, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures from neighboring powers. Many Khazar Jews migrated to Eastern Europe, particularly to Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, where they merged with existing Jewish communities. This migration marked the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry, as Khazar Jews integrated with local Jewish populations, adopting customs and practices from their new environments. During the Middle Ages, some European groups like the Normans and Saxons converted to Judaism, further increasing the Ashkenazi Jewish population. These conversions often occurred in response to economic opportunities or social mobility. Converts brought their own cultural practices and languages, enriching the Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. Over time, the Ashkenazi Jews intermarried with local European populations, adopting customs, languages, and cultural practices. This assimilation contributed to the development of distinct Ashkenazi Jewish traditions, such as Yiddish language and literature. Ashkenazi Jews also developed unique religious practices like the use of Hebrew and Aramaic in liturgy. Hebrew was primarily used as a literary and sacred language until its 20th century revival as a common language in Israel. Ashkenazim adapted their traditions to Europe and underwent a transformation in their interpretation of Judaism. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, Jews who remained in or returned to historical German lands experienced a cultural reorientation. Under the influence of the Haskalah and the struggle for emancipation, as well as the intellectual and cultural ferment in urban centers, some gradually abandoned Yiddish in favor of German and developed new forms of Jewish religious life and cultural identity. Throughout the centuries, Ashkenazim made significant contributions to Europe's philosophy, scholarship, literature, art, music, and science. As a proportion of the world Jewish population, Ashkenazim were estimated to be 3% in the 11th century, rising to 92% in 1930 near the population's peak. The Ashkenazi population was significantly diminished by the Holocaust carried out by Nazi Germany during World War II, which killed some 6 million Jews, affecting almost every European Jewish family. In 1933, prior to World War II, the estimated worldwide Jewish population was 15.3 million. Israeli demographer and statistician Sergio D. Pergola implied that Ashkenazim comprised 65 to 70% of Jews worldwide in 2000, while other estimates suggest more than 75%. As of 2013, the population was estimated to be between 10 million and 11.2 million. Recent genetic studies reveal that Ashkenazi Jews have a complex ancestry, with origins in the Middle East, about 30 to 40%, Europe, about 40 to 50%, and North Africa and the Caucasus, about 10 to 20%. This genetic diversity reflects the Khazars and Ashkenazi Jews' history of migration, intermarriage, and assimilation. Today, Ashkenazi Jews comprise approximately 80% of the global Jewish population, with communities in Europe, North America, Israel, and beyond. Their rich cultural heritage, shaped by centuries of migration and assimilation, continues to influence Jewish identity and traditions worldwide. 2. Sephardi Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Sephardi Jews from Spain and Portugal began migrating to Palestine, then under Ottoman rule. They were drawn by the promise of religious freedom and the chance to escape persecution. As Zionist ideology gained traction, more Sephardi Jews arrived, eager to build a new life in the Jewish homeland. However, they faced discrimination from Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, who saw them as Arab Jews or Oriental Jews. Despite this, the Sephardi Jews thrived in Palestine, establishing communities and cultural institutions. But with the establishment of Israel in 1948, their identity began to shift. Israeli policy and education emphasized the importance of European heritage, and Sephardi Jews began to adopt Ashkenazi customs and language. They were encouraged to abandon their Ladino language and Middle Eastern traditions, which were seen as backward and Arab. As Sephardi Jews assimilated into Israeli society, they started to identify as white and European, distancing themselves from their Middle Eastern and North African roots. This process was reinforced by Israel's Eurocentric culture and the desire to westernize the country. Over time, Sephardi Jews became white Israelis, an identity that obscured their complex history and cultural heritage. Today, some Sephardi Jews in Israel continue to grapple with their identity, seeking to reclaim their Sephardic roots and challenge the dominant Ashkenazi narrative. 3. The Mizrahi Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent. When Israel was founded in 1948, more than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or forced to flee their homes in what is now the Jewish state. But from the early days of the state, there was a group that didn't buy the justification, the Jews with roots in the Arab and Muslim world. Called Mizrahim in Israel, these Jews today make up the largest ethnic group in the country. They mostly immigrated to Israel after 1948, and for much of the country's history, they have been victims of the same kind of anti-Arab ideology that is wielded against the Palestinians. For centuries, Mizrahi Jews had enjoyed high status in their countries of origin in the Middle East and North Africa, which ranged from Iraq to Egypt to Morocco. But when they landed in Israel, they found that the new state was ruled by European Jews, called Ashkenazim, who overwhelmingly viewed them as primitive and culturally backward. As Mizrahi Jews assimilated into Israeli society, they faced intense pressure to abandon their Middle Eastern and North African cultures. This was perpetuated by the Ashkenazi-dominated government, education system, and media, which promoted a Eurocentric worldview. Mizrahi Jews were encouraged to adopt Ashkenazi customs, language, and practices, and suppress their traditional ways. The Israeli government and media often portrayed Mizrahi Jews as backward and uncivilized, and many were forced to abandon their cultural traditions and language in order to become Israeli. Mizrahi Jews were also subject to whitening policies aimed at erasing their non-European features. This included forced assimilation, cultural suppression, and even physical transformation. For example, they were offered nose jobs to fix non-European facial features. Some Mizrahi Jews were even forced to change their names to sound more Israeli in order to gain acceptance and access to resources and opportunities. Through this process, Mizrahi Jews began to identify themselves as white Israelis, a classification that obscured their Middle Eastern and North African heritage. This shift was not a natural evolution, but a result of systemic discrimination and cultural erasure. Mizrahi intellectuals at the time were quick to link the discrimination against them to the discrimination against Palestinians. Orientalism, Palestinian scholar Edward Said's term for a European tendency to portray the East as exotic, irrational, and uncivilized, was being used to cast both groups as inferior and deny them equal rights. Their struggle was one and the same, and so starting in the 1950s, Mizrahim and Palestinians formed a solidarity movement, producing everything from joint magazines to joint street protests. This movement offered a counterpoint to the villa in the jungle view of Israel, an alternative vision for how Jews and Palestinians can live together on the land. It also offers a more nuanced way to think about contemporary debates on the meaning of indigeneity, nationhood, and colonialism in Israel-Palestine. 4. Immigrants from the former Soviet Union and other European countries. In the 1990s and 2000s, a significant wave of immigrants arrived in Israel from the former Soviet Union and other European countries, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others. This migration was driven by various factors, such as political instability, economic hardship, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Many of these immigrants were Jewish or had Jewish ancestry, and were eligible for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. They were attracted to Israel's promise of safety, economic opportunity, and a chance to reconnect with their Jewish heritage. Some were also motivated by a desire to escape anti-Semitism and discrimination in their home countries. As a result, Israel experienced a significant influx of new citizens, who would eventually become an integral part of Israeli society. Upon arrival, they were initially considered others within Israeli society. However, as they assimilated, they began to be perceived as white Israelis. This shift was facilitated by their European background, which aligned with the dominant Ashkanazi culture. As they settled in Israel, they adopted Hebrew, learned about Jewish customs, and integrated into society. Many abandoned their unique cultural identities and embraced Ashkenazi norms, which were seen as the standard for Israeliness. Over time, they became an integral part of Israeli society, contributing to its diversity and complexity. Today, many immigrants from European countries are identified as white Israelis, often unaware of the historical power dynamics that shape their identity. The small country of Israel was established as a refuge for the oppressed white European Jews, who in turn became oppressors of people of color, the Palestinians. Although Israeli society is not racially divided between blacks and whites in the way that American society has long been, still blackness in Israel has shaped the relations between Jews and Arabs, Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, Ethiopians and immigrant workers from Africa. Despite the salience of blackness in Israel, scholars of Israel and the wider academic field of Israel studies have largely ignored it so far. In this video, I argue that the reason for this scholarly neglect is that in Israel, blackness does not neatly fit into the conventional configurations that exist in countries like the US and the UK. I further stipulate that in its uniqueness, the Israeli case shows that blackness transgresses color lines in new and unexpected ways, offering fresh perspectives on Israeli society and challenging the arbitrary stipulations of blackness as a concept. There are many significant differences, but also some similarities. While Israeli society is not racially divided between blacks and whites in the way that American society has long been, Israelis are certainly not colorblind, and having black skin can also have fatal consequences in Israel. For instance, in June 2019, Solomon Teka, an 18-year-old Israeli Jew of Ethiopian descent, was shot to death by an Israeli policeman. This outburst had sparked widespread demonstrations and rioting at the time. The Solomon Teka incident was not an unprecedented event. In April 2015, video footage of Israeli policemen brutalizing Damas Pakada, a Jewish Ethiopian soldier, moved thousands of Israelis, Ethiopians, and others to the streets. One of the reasons this incident prompted a strong reaction was the fact that Pakada was an on-duty soldier wearing his military uniform. Military service is widely perceived as the ultimate rite of passage into Israeli society and as a stamp of approval for being a loyal Israeli citizen. Watching the footage of the assault on Damas Pakada that was captured by a security camera, many Israelis saw Pakada not only as an individual, but as an example of the successful assimilation of Ethiopians in Israel. Yet the incident revealed that despite this assimilation, Ethiopian Israelis still suffer from police brutality and discrimination even when they are in their official garb. Thus, in their protests, Israeli Ethiopians accuse the police and the Israeli establishment more broadly of racism against their community due to their skin color. Such claims by Ethiopian Israelis, and the statistics that support them, have had a strong impact on Israeli public opinion. Notwithstanding the many schisms and tensions characterizing Israeli society, most Israelis still adhere to the idea of eliminating the differences between Jews in the country. Although the term black was used in Israeli discourse even before the establishment of the state and was attributed to various groups, Israelis do not usually perceive themselves or groups in Israeli society in racial terms. Therefore, the Pakada incident, revealing this hidden racial aspect, gained widespread attention in Israel well beyond the Ethiopian community. This was not the first time, however, that blackness was associated with official racism and discrimination in Israel. In 1971, second-generation Mizrahi immigrants living in the poor neighborhood of Musrara in Jerusalem formed the Israeli Black Panther movement. By identifying themselves as blacks, these Mizrahi youngsters alluded to the gap between the official Zionist narrative of ingathering the Jewish exiles and the reality in which some Jews remained outsiders in their home country. For the Israeli Black Panthers, blackness would serve mainly as a metaphor, whereas for Ethiopian Israelis, blackness is the material fact of their skin color, which makes them a target for institutional and systemic discrimination. On and on, the cases of discrimination by white Israelis on the black Israelis still continues. It is clearly obvious that behind the label, white Israeli, lies a complex tapestry of experiences shaped by history, culture, and circumstance. Their identities are multifaceted, influenced by a rich heritage of European Jewish traditions, the trauma of the Holocaust, and the resilience of immigrants seeking refuge. This complex identity is further nuanced by the blending of traditional and modern values and the intricate interplay between ethnicity, religion, and nationality. In closing, the question, "Who are these white Israelis?" echoes through the corridors of history, revealing a complex tapestry of identity, power, and displacement. We have unraveled the threads of European colonization, Zionist ideology, and the dispossession of Palestine. Today we stand at a crossroads where the myth of a homogeneous white Israel crumbles beneath the weight of truth. We recognize the diverse narratives, Ashkanazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi, and Palestinian, intertwined yet conflicted. Let us shatter the illusions of supremacy and reclaim our shared humanity. Let us confront the systems of oppression that have ravaged the Middle East and beyond. To the Palestinian people, we acknowledge your resilience, your struggle, and your right to self-determination. Your freedom is our freedom. To the Israeli people, we urge you to confront the mirror of history and question the narrative of exclusivity. Together we can forge a new path, built on justice, equality, and coexistence. A path where 1. Refugees return home. 2. Walls crumble. And 3. Voices rise. We are the generation that will redefine what it means to be Israeli, Palestinian, and human. We will write a new chapter, one of reconciliation, solidarity, and peace. The time for change is now. That brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. And with that, we say thanks for coming this far with us to the very end. Do kindly hit the thumb button, share this video with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and consider subscribing to stay tuned in with us always for more revealing contents, if you are yet to. We are glad to have you here with us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.